The night my son put his fist through the kitchen wall, I didn't scream. I didn't call the police. I pulled out a chair, sat down at the broken table, and said 4 words that would change both our lives forever. The plaster dust was still falling, soft as snow, when I looked at my son Daniel. He was 16 years old, 6'1", with his father's jaw and my mother's eyes, those deep amber eyes that used to look up at me from a crib, blinking slowly, trusting me completely with every breath he took. Now those same eyes were wild, red around the rims. His knuckles were bleeding. The hole in the wall behind him was the size of a melon, ragged and white, and the refrigerator hummed on as if nothing had happened, as if our whole family hadn't just cracked open alongside the drywall. I am not a woman who panics easily. I raised Daniel mostly alone after his father Marcus left when Daniel was 9. I worked double shifts at the hospital for 2 years straight. I buried my mother, sold her house, and cried in parking lots so my son wouldn't see me fall apart. I had been through things that would level most people. But standing in that kitchen, watching my boy breathe like a wounded animal, I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Fear, real, cold, bone-deep fear. Not of Daniel, never of Daniel. Fear that I had already lost him, and hadn't noticed until the wall came down. It had been building for months, of course. The way these things always build, quietly at first, like a tide. Daniel had stopped eating dinner with me in September. By October he was barely speaking, answering questions with 1 syllable, his eyes sliding past me like I was furniture. His grades dropped from A's to C's to a note from his history teacher that used the phrase, chronically disengaged. He stopped playing basketball, which had been his religion since he was 8 years old. He stopped seeing his friends. He started sleeping until noon on weekends, and then locking himself in his room until dark. I had tried everything I knew. I left notes under his door. I cooked his favorite meals, jerk chicken, rice and peas, the fried plantains my mother taught me, and left them outside his room on a plate like an offering to a god I wasn't sure still existed. I asked him gently, then directly, then desperately what was wrong. I suggested therapy. He said he wasn't crazy. I said nobody was saying he was crazy. He said the conversation was over. I went online. I read articles about teenage boys and emotional withdrawal. I read about depression, about rage, about disconnected fathers and overburdened mothers and boys who fall through the cracks of the world with nobody's hand on them. I bought 2 books. I read them both. I underlined things. I tried different approaches, the detached approach, the warm approach, the I'm not your enemy, I'm your mother speech that I must have rehearsed 40 times in the shower. Nothing reached him. And then came the Tuesday in November when I mentioned, casually, over a dinner he hadn't wanted to sit down for, that I had spoken to his father on the phone, that Marcus had asked how he was doing. I realized I had spent months trying to fix my son when what he needed, what we both needed, was for someone to be honest about what was broken. Daniel put down his fork. Something moved across his face, a shadow fast and dark like a cloud crossing the sun. He stood up from the table. He walked to the kitchen wall, and then he screamed, one long, hoarse, terrible sound, and his fist went through the plaster like it was paper. Silent. That refrigerator hum. And me sitting at the table with my hands in my lap, looking at my son. The 4 words I said were, sit down with me. Not what is wrong with you, not look what you've done, not I'm calling the police or you need help or any of the 1,000 things that were firing through my nervous system in that moment. I pulled out the chair across from me and I said quietly, firmly, like I was anchoring us both to the earth, sit down with me. Daniel looked at the chair. He looked at me. His chest was heaving. The blood from his knuckles was dripping onto the floor, small dark drops on the linoleum, and his eyes were glassy, and I honestly thought, that he might walk out the front door and I might never see him whole again. He sat down. I didn't say anything for a long time. I got up, ran a clean dish towel under cold water, brought it back, and held it against his hand without asking permission. He let me. That small surrender, letting his mother hold his broken hand, undid something in the room. His shoulders dropped, his jaw unclenched. He was still breathing hard, but the wildness was draining out of him slowly, like water through a crack. I said, tell me about your father. Not tell me what's wrong, not why are you so angry. I had been asking those questions for months and they had built walls, not broken them down. I said, tell me about your father. Specific, direct, aimed at the exact wound I had accidentally ripped open. Daniel looked at the table. His jaw worked. And then, and I will never forget this as long as I live, he started to cry. Not the frustrated, angry crying of a child throwing a tantrum. The deep, ugly, gasping cry of someone who has been holding something enormous for far too long and has finally run out of strength to hold it. He doesn't want to know me, Daniel said. He asked how I was doing so he could feel like a good person. He doesn't actually want to know. He was right. I knew he was right the moment he said it, and the knowing was a kind of pain I hadn't braced for. Because I had told myself a story, the comfortable story that Marcus was trying, that the phone calls meant something, that distance could be bridged by occasional contact. I had told Daniel a version of his father that was softer and more reachable than the truth, because I thought protection was the same thing as love. I had been wrong. "You're right," I said. Daniel looked up at me. He hadn't expected that. "Your father loves you in the way he is capable of loving," I said, "but that way is not enough for what you need, and I've been pretending it was enough because I didn't want you to hurt, and you've been hurting anyway, just alone." Something shifted in my son's face. Not happiness, nothing so simple. Something more like the feeling of a room when you open a window that's been painted shut for years. A sudden, raw, almost painful flow of air. "I've been so angry," he said. "I know. I don't know what to do with it." "Neither do I said, "but we're going to figure it out together. And we're going to start by being honest with each other about things I should have been honest with you about a long time ago." I had spent so long trying to be everything to him that I had forgotten to simply be present, to sit in the hard places with him instead of trying to clear them away. That night we talked for 4 hours. The food went cold on the table. I made tea and it went cold too. We talked about Marcus, not the softened version but the real one, the man who had talents and wounds of his own, who had chosen distance, who was neither villain nor hero but simply someone who had made choices that had consequences. We talked about what that loss had cost Daniel, the years of little league games where he'd scanned the bleachers, the performances, the moments he'd wanted a father and found only absence wearing his father's face. We talked about me too, things I hadn't planned to say that came out anyway because the room had changed, because honesty is contagious when someone starts it. I told him I had been lonely. I told him I had been scared of him, not of his fists, but of the distance, of the feeling that I was losing my son the way I had lost his father, slowly and without a clear moment to fight. I told him that I had made mistakes, that I had chosen comfort over truth, that I was sorry. He said, "You never have to be sorry for trying to protect me, Mom." I cried then. He put his arm around me, my 16-year-old boy, with his bloody knuckles and his father's jaw and his whole bruised heart, and he held me. We sat there in the kitchen with the hole in the wall and the cold tea and the plaster dust, and I thought, this is what I was so afraid of, and it is not what I thought it was at all. The weeks that followed were not easy, let me be clear about that. One honest conversation does not fix what years of silence have layered down. Daniel started seeing a therapist, not because I forced him, but because he asked me to help him find one, which felt like a kind of miracle I hadn't dared to pray for. There were still bad days, still slammed doors and short answers and moments where I could feel the old walls going up. But there was something different now, underneath all of it. A door that had been opened that neither of us wanted to close again. I made changes too. I stopped managing Daniel's image of his father. I let Marcus be who he was, called less, expected less, stopped trying to broker a relationship between them that Marcus had never truly committed to. That was hard. It felt like giving up, but Daniel noticed. He said once, almost in passing, "It feels better when you're not trying to make him into something he isn't," and he was right again. The fantasy of a father who might one day show up had been, in its own way, crueler than the truth. Daniel went back to basketball in January. Not for a team at first, just shooting hoops alone at the park near our house, and then with a friend, and then with a group of boys I started seeing on our front steps on Saturday afternoons, loud and easy in the way that young men are when they finally feel safe. His grades came back, not all the way to where they'd been, but steady, improving, moving in the right direction. He started eating dinner with me again. Sometimes he even cooked. The hole in the kitchen wall stayed there for 3 months. I didn't rush to fix it. Maybe that was strange, but every time I looked at it I thought, this is where something broke open that needed to break open. This is where my son ran out of ways to hold it all in, and where I finally stopped trying to hold it all together, and where, in the rubble of both those failures, we found something sturdier than anything we'd had before. When we finally repaired the wall, Daniel and I, a Saturday in February with a YouTube tutorial and 2 trips to the hardware store, he patched it with a kind of careful attention that surprised me. He smoothed the compound with his palm, waited for it to dry, sanded it down by hand. He painted it himself, 2 coats, matching the color exactly. When he was done, you couldn't tell it had ever been broken. I stood back and looked at the wall and then at my son, flour-speckled and paint-smudged, standing with his arms crossed and his head tilted, studying his own work. "Good as new," he said. "Better," I said. He looked at me, those amber eyes, my mother's eyes, steady and clear and present, not afraid of what they might find if they looked too long. "Yeah," he said, "maybe better." He was 17 by then. He would be grown and out the door in a handful of years, carrying everything I had given him and everything life had taken from him, and a self-knowledge that I hoped would serve as armor and compass both. I didn't know what kind of man he would become. But I knew something I hadn't known the night the wall came down. He would become himself. Not a performance of fine, not a mask over a wound. Himself, cracked in places, healed in others, honest about both. That was the thing no one expected me to do. Not to fight, not to panic, not to call for help from someone else. To simply stay in the room with my son, in the wreckage of the thing we'd both been too careful to say, and refused to leave until we had found each other on the other side of it. It was the hardest and the best thing I have ever done. And it began with 4 words, spoken quietly, to a boy with bleeding knuckles and a broken open heart. "Sit down with me."